Our gospel today continues discussions about money, or wealth, in Greek, mammon. Our gospel today is what is known as part of Luke's travel narrative. Remember, several weeks ago, we heard that Jesus had set his face to go to Jerusalem. So these stories and parables that we have been hearing take place as Jesus is traveling on his way. He teaches the disciples along the way, addresses the crowd traveling with him, and debates with the Pharisees and religious leaders. In some cases, Jesus is speaking directly with the disciples. In some cases, with the Pharisees. But both groups are there and are able to hear what he is saying. Today, for example, we're told Jesus is talking to the disciples, but the previous parable had just been directed to the Pharisees. So they're still there and listening. That's important to remember. Jesus ends what he says today by saying, "You cannot serve God and wealth." And the very next verse, which we don't hear, says, "The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they ridiculed him." We have heard Jesus scold them before for putting themselves above others, regarding themselves as knowing more than others, and exploiting the poor. Jesus, who eats with tax collectors and sinners, who ministers to the marginalized and those outside of society, reveals the gap that exists between the wealthy and the poor, between those who have and those who have not, between the privileged and the exiled. We hear much of the same in our reading from Amos today. Amos was an 8th century BCE prophet from the southern kingdom of Judah, who was called by God to preach to the wealthy and complacent people of the northern kingdom of Israel, who, because of their injustice and inequality, would eventually be taken into exile by the Assyrians. Their prosperity in a time of peace led to great wealth and great greed, creating a further economic divide between the rich and the poor. Amos warns them that they will have to account for their actions to God, who will not forget the deeds they have done, charging people more for less and enslaving those who are desperate to survive. Because they love and serve wealth, earthly things, possessions, more than God. Now, with that in mind, we hear Jesus' parable of the dishonest steward. But first, I want to back up to what we heard last week. We heard that the Pharisees and scribes were grumbling about Jesus eating and being with tax collectors and sinners, to which Jesus replied with 3 parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost or prodigal son. We didn't hear the prodigal son part because that's used at a different time in the lectionary. But it's important to see how it fits in with what we heard last week, because it feeds into the reason Jesus uses the parable of the dishonest steward today. Both the lost prodigal son parable and the dishonest steward talk about one squandering their wealth. In the lost son story, we're told that the youngest son squandered what had been given to him in dissolute living. In today's parable, we're told that the manager of a rich man's property was squandering it, but we don't know how. Both parables are set up in a similar way to ultimately show God's forgiveness and mercy in the case of the prodigal, and to show how we must be faithful to one master, that is, God alone. The youngest son did not have the intent to harm his father when he ran off with his property, and likewise the dishonest manager did not intend to harm his master by reducing the bills of his master's debtors. They were not evil intentions. Their intent was not to harm as much as it was to gain something for themselves. Again, Jesus tells this parable of the dishonest steward to the disciples, but the Pharisees, whom he had just been addressing, are still close enough to hear what he says, and Jesus wants them to hear him. Jesus tells this parable of the dishonest steward and then tells what our response to it should be. And I would caution you not to get hung up on the word dishonest, and you'll find out why in a minute. What did he do that was dishonest? Again, we don't actually know. All we're told is that he squandered his master's property. He was ineffective as a manager and therefore let go. But others didn't know that he was let go. And so he must act quickly to protect himself. He goes into crisis mode, we might say. I'm sure many of us know what this is. We've had moments when we've had to act quickly in order to salvage a situation. And quite honestly, when forced into a quick decision, we can sometimes come up with a clear, successful response. Not always, but sometimes. For example, when someone asks you why you responded the way you did, you might say, well, if I hadn't reacted the way I did and as quickly as I did, I might not have been successful. If I had stalled long enough in order to think through it, I may have come to a different conclusion. And now where would I be? It's a gut reaction. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But remember, they occur because we're forced into a situation. Here, the steward is forced into a corner. How will I live, he says. How will I survive? I'm too weak to dig, too proud to beg, and so he makes his decision. He calls in some of those who owe his master, and he reduces their bill. Now, to understand how large of a reduction that is, we have to understand the quantity of what we're dealing with here. It's not just household jugs of oil or containers of wheat. The Greek words used here have specific meaning. The 100 jugs of oil would have been the equivalent of 900 gallons. The 100 containers of wheat would have been the equivalent of anywhere from 600 to 1,200 bushels. The manager's reductions are quite large. He acts shrewdly, but in doing so accomplishes two things which are good. He makes himself look good by helping them so that they might receive him when he is out of a job and on the street. And he makes his master look good for being so kind and compassionate. And his master commends him for being shrewd. His intent was not to harm, but to save himself. He had a gut reaction that, it seems in this case, worked. Jesus tells the disciples and us to do the same. Be shrewd with the children of this age. Use dishonest wealth to gain friends. And this is where we can get stuck on that word, dishonest. What is dishonest wealth? Is that like money we get by hurting others, robbing others, taking what doesn't belong to us? Well, it sounds that way, but that's not what is meant. It simply means worldly, earthly possessions. These are not necessarily bad things, just things of this world, not of heaven. They are not necessarily against God, but run the risk for us of replacing God. Jesus says you cannot serve God and wealth. We as a society can get overwhelmed, consumed by wealth, money, possessions, things. Having them is not bad. Having them take over our lives is. Having them become idols that replace God is. Having them control us, literally become the master of our lives, is what Jesus means when he says we cannot serve two masters. We have a master, God, and that is all we need. But you might ask, these things don't really take over our lives, do they? Well, look around. Every day we hear of neglect and abuse as a result of worldly things controlling our lives. Things like drugs or money or power. Jesus says, make friends through worldly wealth. Take what you have, money, possessions, whatever is of this world, and use it for good. Give to the poor. Help those less fortunate. Support those who cannot support themselves. Give to the church. I'm sorry, you may not have heard that one yet. Give to the church. Stewardship is always in season. Give to a greater good. Give to God so that you will be received into your eternal home. Be shrewd, act quickly, for the time is coming when you will be received into the kingdom. Don't squander it. Don't use it to create more pain or more evil. Use it for good. Use it for God, our true master. As long as we have earthly, worldly possessions, there will be something we can do with them. Listen again to our collect. Grant us, Lord, not to be anxious about earthly things, but to love things heavenly. And even now, while we are placed among things that are passing away, to hold fast to those that shall endure. We only live on this earth once. Shouldn't we take every opportunity we have to make it a better place for us and for others? Shouldn't we take the good fortune we are given by God and give it back to God? Shouldn't we be shrewd in helping all people realize God's grace and love for them? Shouldn't we have the same sense of urgency as the steward to do whatever we can to provide for our future? We should, and we do. We realize that we too need that same gut reaction, that same decisive act when we hear the gospel. For in doing all this, we prepare ourselves for the coming of the kingdom and provide for our place in our eternal home. This is the grace given to us by God through Christ, as we are called to respond, to act, to love, and to come to him who loved us and died for us, so that we might have life forever. Amen.